Welcome everyone to the Reed and Christine Halliday Executive Lecture Series. Our guest speaker today is Dan Howells. Dan has been a longtime member of our National Advisory Committee here for the Woodbury School of Business. And he's worked in 7 different major corporations across America in major management positions. In particular, he's worked as Executive Vice President at Marriott for a division that employed 150,000 people and had $3 billion worth of revenue. He also was a manager at Six Flags. Now, I remember as a child growing up in Southern California when Magic Mountain first opened. Some of you may have been there. And then when I was a young man studying business in college, I remember reading about Dan being sent by Six Flags after they purchased Magic Mountain to go over and to change operations a bit and changed a number of things. I remember in particular that they stopped serving alcohol in the premises, and that made it much more family friendly and such. Since it was one of my favorite theme parks growing up, I watched that quite closely. And then Dan went on to be the head of Six Flags, which has theme parks throughout the United States and in Mexico and Canada. In fact, one of the trivia questions is, what are those Six Flags? As I recall, on a trip to Six Flags, it was the Six Flags that have flown over Texas at some point in time, Spanish, French, U.S., the Republic of Texas, and Mexico, and the Confederate flag, right? So whenever you hear Six Flags, those are the Six Flags. So then now you've learned something in business school that you can carry on with your families and your children and your grandchildren, right? Ask them, so what are those Six Flags? Anyway, please join me in welcoming Dan Howells.
Eugene, it would probably confuse you, but there's Six Flags over Georgia at the time I joined the company, and Six Flags over Mid-America, and each one had a separate set of flags because the territory that they were in had different flags that flew over them. But yeah, I was impressed. I don't know, sure I could remember all the 6 original flags at Six Flags over Texas. I got a call a few days ago from Randy Beckham asking me to come down and speak to this group, and I said I'd be delighted to. I've been as mentioned, on the NAC, the National Advisory Council, for a number of years now, and I've really gotten invested in Utah Valley University, and in particularly in the Woodbury Business School. I think this is one of the great institutions in the state. I think it's going to be, as time goes on, the leading university in the state. And I was pleased to answer and say yes, I'd be delighted to go down and speak to the students at that. When he called me, I thought about a story that Ronald Reagan used to tell. He said that years ago there was a Republican politician that was running for a public office in a state that had been totally Democrat for years and years and years. And this fellow was determined that he was going to get himself elected. So he did everything that he could. And one afternoon he was out traveling down a road in a farm country, and he saw a farmer standing in his field. So he got out of his car and he walked over to the fence and he introduced himself to the farmer, and the farmer says, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I'm a Republican candidate for office in the state, and I just wanted to introduce myself to you." The farmer looked at him, he said, "I have never met a Republican in my entire life." He said, "This is really an honor to have you come by. What are you here for?" And he said, "Well, I've been given my speech about why I should be elected to office." And the farmer said, "Well, I would be delighted to have you give your speech to myself and my wife. Would you be willing to do that?" And he said, "Well, I sure would. I'd be glad to tell you what I think and what I stand for." So the farmer went in the house to get his wife and come out and hear the speech. And while the candidate that was looking around, he decided he needed something to stand on when he gave the speech. He was looking for a tree stump or something like that, and he couldn't find anything. And he looked over, and he saw a hardened pile of cow manure. And he thought, well, now, that might work if it's not too soft. So he walked over, and it was really hard. It was like a rock. He says, that'll work. And by that time, the farmer and his wife came out, and they leaned against the fence, and he climbed up on the cow manure and he delivered his speech. At the end of the speech, and the farmer said, "You know, that's the first time I've ever heard a Republican speech." And the Republican looked down at the farmer and his wife, and he said, "You know, that's the first time I've ever delivered a Republican speech from a Democratic platform." Now, when Randy called, I started thinking, what can I say to you all that would help you in what you're trying to do? And as I thought back, I thought to myself, about 45 plus years ago, I was sitting where you sit. I wasn't here at this school, but I was at the one up the hill, up the I-15, the University of Utah. And I had give you a little bit of my background. I grew up in Salt Lake City, went in the military for 6 months, and then had an 8-year obligation that I fulfilled, and then was called by the Mormon Church to serve a mission in Scotland. And I served my mission in Scotland, and it was one of the great experiences of my life. And when you go out on a mission, you ask yourself, people are always asking you on your mission, what are you going to do when you return home? And I didn't like to answer that question by saying I don't know. So I thought to myself, I had one semester or one quarter at the University of Utah, and I registered as a pre-law student. But when I got out in the mission field, I encountered a totally different culture. Fortunately, they spoke a form of English over there. And as I listened to them and watched them, I became very interested, and in the process of what I was doing for the church, very interested in how people make decisions. What is it that causes people to do what they do or what they don't do? Became very fascinated by that whole art of decision making. When I returned home from my mission, I read a book that was called The Hidden Persuaders by a man by the name of Vance Packard. It was the first book that I read, and it was a number of books that I read about that, and I became even more interested in why do people do what they do. So I changed my major at the University of Utah from pre-law to marketing and advertising. And as I got into that major at the University of Utah, I loved it. I just loved what you're able to do in terms of moving people with the mass market media. And that became my major. And as I was going through school at the University of Utah, thoroughly enjoying it, and I knew that my wife and I got married. I knew that I wanted to go on to graduate school, but I didn't know where I wanted to go to graduate school. So it so happened that we had Dr. Forrest became part of the faculty at the University of Utah, and I took a class from him, and it was one of the great classes I had at the school on persuasion and how you go about persuading people in the mass market area. And I went in one time to talk to him about part of this classwork, and he asked me, he said, "Dan, what are you going to do when you graduate from here?" I'd gone for about 3.5 years up there, and I was getting to the point where I was going to graduate. This is about a year before I was to graduate. And I said, "Well, I'm planning on applying for a graduate school, but I don't know where to go." And then he said, "Well, what is your interest?" And I said, "Well, my interest are the things that you're teaching. I'm interested in mass market and how do you move the marketplace." And he said, "Well, you know," he said, I think the best school for you to go to is one that I've been at for the last 8 years. And I said, "Where's that?" And he said, "It's at Northwestern in Chicago, in the Medill School. They have a great program there for marketing and advertising." And he said, "I think you'd really enjoy that." So I applied to Medill and got accepted, actually got a scholarship, the Agate Club scholarship to go there. And then my wife and I got in our little Volkswagen Beetle that I'd acquired when I came home from my mission, loaded it up with every earthly possession that we had, and went off to go to school at Northwestern University. Now, the interesting thing about this, and I want to just make this as an aside, I can tell you one of the key things to succeeding in the business world is to have a firm foundation in a marriage. Harry Truman used to have make the statement that behind every successful man is a supporting, nurturing woman and a surprised mother-in-law. And that fits. My wife, I think, I give very great credit to as being one of the factors in the things that I've been able to accomplish in my career. She had a slogan that she never worked out of the house initially, right at the beginning of our marriage, but was always a housewife from then on. But she used to have this slogan that she said she followed the checkbook, because as I describe my experience after graduate school, you'll understand why. But with graduate school at Northwestern was a terrific experience. We had great opportunities, and in fact, we had the opportunity to work with major companies in the area. The last project that we had, which was we were divided up. It's a very small class, and they keep it very small. There was only 27 students in my graduate class at Northwestern. And at the last project that we had, they divided us up into 3 groups, so that we were called ad agencies. And we went out to Motorola Television and went through with the president of Motorola and his whole marketing staff, and they assigned us, at that time, color televisions were just becoming popular, and they assigned us a project to develop a marketing campaign for the launch of a color television for Motorola. And they made us sign statements that said, 1, we would not divulge the information that they gave us, and 2, that anything we came up with was their property. And they then introduced us to the product development they had, and they had developed a television, a console television, and they knew that back then when you used these vacuum tubes, they were going to eventually burn out, and you needed a way of servicing them. So they created a concept, the engineers did, where you would pull the works out of the TV, and it came out slid out on a rail, and they could take it out and you could take it in and have it serviced, which was an important thing at that time, because televisions often did need servicing. So they gave us that project, and we worked on that and worked for about 8 weeks, putting it together, doing the market research, doing the things, actually creating creative for the product. And at the end of the time, we presented to Motorola's management the ideas that we had. Interestingly, a year or so later, when I was in New York, later in New York, I looked at the television and I saw an advertisement, a commercial for Motorola televisions. And the line that they used was the line that the works are in the drawer, which was one of the lines that one of the ad agencies, the 3 ad agencies that we had created. They had picked that line up and that campaign up, and that's what they went with. Felt really good about that. Northwestern was a great experience, and we had at that time, and I wish I could say it was going to be the same for you, but it's not right now. We had a tremendous opportunities presented to us. For the last couple of weeks after we were wrapping up graduate school, they started bringing in companies from all over the country to recruit for the 27 people in the school. I had so many opportunities to interview that I had to throw some of them away. And I ended up interviewing with probably about 20 companies. And of the 20 companies, I ended up with 11 firm offers. And I didn't know how I was doing versus the other fellows in the class, but I just knew that I felt pretty good about it. And then I got the dean, Dr. Freiberger, his secretary came and said, Dr. Freiberger would like to see you. And so I went in. I didn't know why he was calling or what he wanted. And as I sat down with him, he said, Dan, I want to congratulate you. He said, you have done extremely well in this interviewing process. He said, you've gotten, and I didn't know it at the time, but they required that the companies tell the school when they were making offers and so on. And he said, you've gotten more offers than anybody else in your graduating class. He said, I said, I'm really curious to know what you're planning on doing. Well, I'd interviewed in the process with a company from New York called Gray Advertising. And Gray Advertising, I'd done research on it the best I could. It wasn't like you guys today with your internet sitting in front of you. You could type in the Gray Advertising on your Apple computer over here, and you'll know all about Gray Advertising in a minute. I had to go to the library and research it. And I researched each one of the companies, and I concluded that I wanted to go with Gray Advertising for a couple of reasons. One, they were the best marketing ad agency in the country. They were the 6th largest in the country, and they were renowned for their ability to put together marketing plans, and I felt that this would be a great opportunity. So I told him that. He said, "That's right." He said, "You've got that identified correctly." And then I said, and the other thing, Dr. Freiberger, is I don't plan on staying in the ad agency business my entire career. But I want to have the experience of what goes on in an ad agency so I can understand it. And it was a good thing that I did that, because over the balance of my career, I managed over 20 different advertising agencies as a client. And so it was useful to know what was going on with these within the ad agency. And he said, "That's good." And he said, I think your logic makes a lot of sense, but you need to understand. He says 2 things. He said, "How much do you know about Jewish people?" And I thought, what an odd question. I said, "I don't know anything about Jewish people. I grew up in Salt Lake City, and I don't think I ever met a Jewish person in Salt Lake City." And he said, "Well, you need to understand, Gray is the Jewish ad agency in the United States." I thought, well, what difference does that make? And it didn't really make any difference, but he was just trying to get me. The cultural difference was what he was trying to help me, because he wanted me to succeed. And he said, "I want you to also know that you're going into the Marine Corps boot camp when it comes to advertising agencies. This place is really tough. They really demand a lot of their people." So I said, "Well, I'm not afraid of that, but I appreciate what you're telling me these things." And he said, "I think you make sense. If I were you, I'd follow your plan." So I joined Gray Advertising for the first job that I had, and everything that I had expected turned out to be true. It was a tough place to work. It was very difficult. In fact, I was assigned to work with a man that I worked with for 7 months, and it was the worst experience in my business career. This guy was an absolute fanatic. He was the best man I've ever known at working numbers. And of course, that was not my forte. It was work, and we used to have to, at that time, do indices on brand development or brand potential indices where you'd have to calculate. And we didn't have a computer. We didn't have a handheld calculator. You had to use those old machines that with the clickety-click would go across, and then you have to estimate where the decimal point goes. That was tough. But I learned a lot working for this guy. It was terrible. I used to go home to my wife and I'd say, "I don't know how much longer, how much more of this I can stand." And finally, after 7 months of doing this, the vice president of the agency called me and he said, "Dan," "you're amazing." He said, "We've had 10 different graduate students that came in out of graduate school, worked with this guy, and only the most that any of them have ever lasted was 4 weeks. He said, "You've lasted 7 months." He said, "I want to congratulate you." He says, "We've finally decided we've got to make a change. We're letting him go, and we're going to assign you to another guy." And I was so grateful for that, because the next guy that I was assigned to, we were working on General Foods business, which is now part of the Kraft division. And I really loved that. We started getting into what makes people make a decision about food. And the two brands that we were on were Post cereals and Kool-Aid. I had a ball doing that. And one of the fellows up there at General Foods was a fellow by the name of Bob Phillips. He was way up in the organization, brand manager on both of those brands, a very prestigious job. And I got to know him quite well. I remember when I'd go up to General Foods, which was up in White Plains and about an hour away from downtown Manhattan, I'd sit down, go up there, and he'd say, "Dan, come on in my office." And so I'd go in his office, and we'd sit down there, and he'd say, "What do you think about this?" And so I'd give him my opinion on it. He'd say, "What do you think about that?" And we had these discussions quite a bit. And I was really, really pleased by that, and I felt like I had a good rapport with the guy. Then went up there one day, and I went, and his office was empty. And I said to the people there, I said, "Where's Bob Phillips?" And they said, "Well, he quit." So what do you mean he quit? He said, "Well, he quit and about 4 other guys quit. And they've gone down to Cheeseboro Ponds to be product managers and group product managers at Cheeseboro Ponds." And I thought, well, that's too bad. I'll miss the guy, and I was going to try and get hold of him, but I didn't really do it. A few weeks later, I got a call from the vice president of human resources at Cheeseboro Ponds, and the guy said, I'm calling on the behalf of Bob Phillips, and he wants to talk to you. He'd like to talk to you about coming to work for Cheeseboro Ponds. Now, the interesting thing, I am on a corporate path now. You guys sitting here, you folks sitting here in this office, you've got 3 options essentially. You can become an entrepreneur, you can go to work in a small company, or you can get on a corporate path. Now, I got on a corporate path by default. I didn't really realize at the time that I was headed in the direction of a corporate path, but I got on a corporate path. Well, at that point, I was somewhat frustrated. I had fulfilled my interest in Gray. I had had a lot of good experience at Gray, put media plans and marketing plans together, advertise, creative plans, and so on. And I felt like I'd done as much as I wanted to do unless I moved up in the management organization at Gray. And I really didn't want to do that because I felt that I wanted to be close to the actual business. I had a man that I had a tremendous amount of respect for later in my career told me, he said, "Dan," he said, "one day you're going to learn that the action is in the line and you're going to get out of the staff work." Now, there's no bigger staff job than being an ad agency to your client. You know, a staff being defined as a person that doesn't get results directly, but does it through influencing those that do. That line people being people that get results directly or through people they directly supervise. And I said to myself, this is what I want to do. So the next thing I did is I joined Cheeseboro Ponds. And it was a great experience. I was assigned to work on a test market product that we had there at Cheeseboro Ponds. And we had 2 products. We were putting them into competitive test markets to see which one would do the best. And the other group was a group called the Vaseline group. And what we had identified through our market research is that women, because of the harshness of detergents and so on, they like to have a hand lotion that was more effective than the normal hand lotions with the smell on them and so on. And we concluded that we needed to create that. So we created 2 products, the same product, exactly the same formulation in both products, and took them to test market. The product the Vaseline group had was Vaseline Intensive Care Lotion. And the product that we had was Pond's, I was in the Pond's group, Pond's Heavy Duty Hand Lotion. Well, you probably know which one won. Vaseline Intensive Care became a tremendously big product for Cheeseboro Ponds. And the other guy that was working on this was the product manager, and we talked quite a bit. Was a fellow that was by the name of Rich Payne, and he and I competed, and we went through this, and I didn't really think much about it. And I was getting invested at Cheeseboro Ponds, and I was concerned about it. My concern was this, that I was going to be, for the rest of my life, in California, in New York and on the East Coast. It was back in those days, you didn't pick up the telephone and call home like you did today. It cost you a lot of money to call home, so we didn't do that. And we went home once a year to visit, but I was becoming increasingly anxious about am I going to be here at Cheeseboro Ponds for the rest of my life? Because they had a program where they would take your salary increase that you got each year, and you would buy stock in the company with it. And then some of your existing salary would go to that. And then they had this massive matching program. And each year you would accumulate stock, and it was back in those days, Cheeseboro Ponds stock was increasing greatly in value. And everybody called it the Golden Handcuffs program, because the more you got invested in this, the more you did. But it was about 5-year vesting. It was difficult to live during that period of time because your salary kept going down every year. That bothered me. And then we had a child, our oldest daughter. And I remember coming home one night, and my wife said, I took Brittany out to the park yesterday with my friend. and she was afraid to get down on the grass. I said, what do you mean? She said, grass scared her. We lived in a high-rise apartment building, and I thought, you know, I'm from Utah. I grew up with grass. I grew up with all these things, and I'm not happy about my daughter being afraid of grass. So these things were mulling in my mind, and came in one day, and Rich Payne had resigned and had gone out to the West Coast. And I got a call a few weeks later, and he said, Dan, I'm group product manager for a division of international paper called the Facel Group. And I want you to come out here and be a brand manager. And I said, well, you know, I was more interested than I wanted to let on. He said, if you'll do it, I'll double your salary. Now, that's a pretty good incentive when you think about it. So I got on a plane one Friday afternoon and flew out there for the weekend and spent Saturday, Sunday, and Monday out there interviewing. And International Paper had built a 1 million square foot plant to manufacture paper. The company was called Facel, F-A-C-E-L-L-E, and they had created this company in Canada, and it was doing extremely well. So they decided to bring it down to the United States and opened it up in the 11 western states and built this massive plant. Well, long story short, I ended up at Facel and had a great experience at Facel. Learned a lot about the business. And sometime later, a few years later, they wanted to move us back to New York. I'm going to come back in greater detail on this in a minute. And so I started looking around again, thinking, what am I going to do? Really not looking for a job, because one of the things I was doing, they wanted me to stay for as long as I would. But I told them I really didn't want to go back to New York, and that was a problem. And in the process, I was serving as an executive secretary to a bishop who had been a president and CEO of a Fortune 400 company. And I told him about my concerns about what was happening in my work, and he said, you know, you ought to look into this deal at Six Flags over Texas. And I said, what's a Six Flags? And he said, I thought it was a Nine Flags cologne. And he told me about it, and so I got in contact with the people on that. He put me on, and I interviewed, and long story short, I ended up at Six Flags over Texas and spent the next 15 years of my career working my way up from marketing director, where I had responsibility for all the front gate attendance, merchandise, and food service, basically running the biggest revenue areas of the company. I went from managing a secretary to managing 1,500 people at Six Flags. And I spent that time there, moved my way up, and ended up going out to manage Magic Mountain. And because of the success we had there, my boss, who was the president of Six Flags, called me one day and he said, I'm leaving. And he said, I'm going to go to become president and CEO of Western Airlines. And he said, I want you to come with me to run the marketing operation for Western Airlines. And I said to him, as I had done before, I'll go with you if I don't get your job. And he kind of looked at me like, because he knew what was going to happen. The next thing, the president of the parent company, Bally Manufacturing, flew in on their plane, and I met him. Met him at the airport, got in their limousine. We drove around L.A., and by the time we got out of the car, I was president of Six Flags, and stayed at Six Flags for as I said, for 15 years. And one day I got a call from a very good friend of mine who is a missionary companion, and he said, this was a little bit earlier that I got this call, and when I was still running Magic Mountain, he said, you know, there's somebody you need to meet. And I said, who's that, Ralph? And he said, well, I'm going to bring him out to your house, and we'd like to go over to the park. And so we went over to the park, and I met Dick Marriott and took Dick Marriott, and Dick Marriott then recruited me into Marriott Corporation. And finally, after being in the Marriott Corporation, I ended up running a business in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. And from there, I came out here after 32 years, back to Utah, having served on the board of directors of the Franklin Covey Company. And was asked by one of the fellow board members to come out and talk to people about being a president and CEO of Nature Sunshine, and that's where I retired. So that's my career in a nutshell. Now I want to go back and spend just a couple of minutes at the Facel thing. When I went to Facel, one of the things that I did is I spent about 30 nights in downtown in Hollywood at a company called Audience Studies, Inc., trying to understand the paper towel industry. And I told you I like to understand why people buy. Audience Studies is a company that 364 days a year they show, have 300 people, and they view movies. The Hollywood establishment uses this company, and people sit with dials in their hands, and they rate the movie as it goes along. And in the process of this, they insert advertising for different products. And they have done this so long and so often that they have what they call normative data, that you put your product down there and they'll tell you how effective your advertising is against what Procter & Gamble or Scott or any of the others are doing. So I sat down there, and at the end of the day, they then bring women, about 10 or 15 women, into a room, and you sit and watch them on a closed-circuit TV, and they talk about paper towels. I learned through that process that there are three things women want in a paper towel. One is absorbency, secondly is strength, and then there's a distance third, which was a negative at that time, and that's what does it look like. Out of that, I got the happy idea that we ought to decorate our towels, make them look like a piece of wallpaper, which we did. And our share of market went in 6 months from 1.5% to over 19%. And based on that, I got it one day, the president of the company came in and he said, I want you to go into a management training program. And because we think you've got great potential, and we're going to put you out in the factory. So the next thing I knew, I was working the night shift in the factory for 4 months. And after that, I got a call again to go to Jim Murphy's office, along with the fellow who had been kind of shepherding me through this, the assistant plant manager. He came to me one night and he said, what's going on? We're supposed to be in his office tomorrow. And I said, well, I don't know. You tell me what's going on. So we went into the next day to the meeting, and we walked in, and there was two men that I'd never seen before. And Jim Murphy said, this man is Ed Schley, and a fellow works with him. And he's the best management thinker in the United States. He was introduced. And I said, well, I thought, wow, that's interesting. That's a great endorsement from the CEO of the company. And then he handed us, both this other fellow, Alex, and he handed us 2 plane tickets. He said, you're going, on Sunday night, you're going to Palo Alto, and you're going to spend the next week with Ed Schley in Palo Alto at his office. It's the best thing that ever happened to me in my business career. I was taught the system that Schley developed, and he had it in Monsanto and Ford and 3M, companies all over the country that were impressed. It was called management by results. Ed's dead today, but you can go on the line, you still find many of his books. Go online, you'll find many of his books. I then was taken, as was Alex Aiken, and Ed said, the way I make a program work in a company is I take 2 key people. I teach them how to implement management by results. And we had spent from 8 o'clock in the morning till 11 o'clock at night for 5 days being indoctrinated into this program. And I then taught the program for 1.5 years to all the people. It was the most effective and important thing I ever did. When I finally got a major management position and became the president of the general manager of Six Flags Over Texas, the president came down. It was one of those situations, again, where my boss had asked me to go to another theme park, and I said, I'll go if I don't get your job. And I did get his job, and the president of the company came in, and when I took him back out to the airport, we'd had a press conference and introduced me to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And he said, when he got ready to get out of the car, he said, take care of that $750 million pile of assets you got. And then secondly, he said, you got to do something about your downtime. And I didn't know what he was talking about. I had never worked in the operations or the maintenance end of the business. So he said, look, he could see I didn't know what he was talking about. He said, well, talk to Margie and talk to Ray, and they'll tell you what the problem is. So I had the chance to then apply the management by results, a result being any accomplishment that can be measured and has a positive impact on your profit and loss. I went back out to the park, and this is what I found. A downtime in a theme park is when something shut down. And it's a bad thing because every time something's shut down, the guest is not having a good experience. And sometimes if you have a lot of downtime, a guest will go from one downtime to another. So I went back and I sat down with the manager of the maintenance department and the gal who was the manager of the operations department. I said, what's downtime? And they explained to me. They said, well, we got a problem with that, Dan. I said, what's the problem? He said, well, our other parks, the most downtime they have is 1.5 minutes. We've got almost 8 minutes in this park. We were the oldest park in the system. So I then said to them, I want you to get the maintenance people together and the operations people together. And I sat down with them and I explained this management by results. I said, one of the result we're looking for is decreased downtime. I want you to tell me, I'm not going to tell you, you set a basic level in it and an outstanding level in it, and I'll come back in a week and you tell me what it should be. And so I came back in a week and they'd set a very aggressive goal. They set the outstanding level at 30 seconds and the basic level at 4 minutes. And I said, you sure you think you can do that? We're going to do it, Dan. Their whole focus changed. All of a sudden, the downtime just started to decrease in the park amazingly. We were going from the worst almost to vying for the best. And I'll close with this example. I got a call from my boss. He said, Dan, what in the heck are you doing with the downtime? Are you cheating on that? And I said, no. They've changed the whole way they're approaching it. I didn't do anything. I just set a goal for them. And he said, well, this is really and truly amazing. And one day I came into the park and I got there and I put my radio on my hip and went out in the park and I heard the guy who was the number 2 guy in the maintenance department call on the phone. He said, Dan, can you come down to the antique carousel? And I went down to the antique carousel and there they were. There were a whole bunch of maintenance guys standing around looking at this thing and the thing was shut down. And they said, we've got a problem. This antique, beautiful antique carousel with hand-carved wooden horses and so on. He said, this happened to us several years ago where the main bearing in the carousel has gone out, and we have to replace it. And in order to replace it, we've got to tear the whole carousel apart, and it's going to be down for 2 weeks, and it's going to destroy our downtime. And I thought, I really felt bad. I thought, gee whiz, this is just really, because these guys have done so well, but they're still going to do really well. They're probably going to beat their basic, and they're going to, I thought, this is just amazing what this motivation has done for them. So I went home that night really kind of down, feeling badly about it. And the next day I came back into the park, and as soon as I got on the radio, they called me and said, can you come down to the antique carousel? So I went down to the antique carousel, and there was the carousel running. And I thought, how in the heck did you, John Hodnett was the assistant manager. I said, John, how'd you do that? And he said, well, the guys got around last night, and they were so concerned about the downtime that one of them figured out if we brought a 100-ton crane in, we could lift the carousel up, get to the main bearing, replace it, and put it back down. And that's what we did. Having an objective changes behavior in the way people do their things. I could tell you a lot of things about Schley that I just don't have time, but that was the one thing that I learned more than anything else. And from wherever I went then on, I set the people down, taught them about management by results, and put them on results framed into objectives by adding the dimensions of how much and by when. I hope this has been useful to you, and at this point, I guess, Randy, we want to open for questions. Is that right? If there are any questions. Yes. Why don't you just stand up and ask your question? Don't be bashful. Yeah.
When you're teaching management by results and everything, did you ever offer any incentives, anything like that, to add the motivation besides goals?
Yeah, Schley used to say that you can change behavior by just defining what the results are. Take a salesman, for example. A salesman, basically, you do a thing called job purpose analysis. And in job purpose analysis, you have on the one side of the sheet the activities that person does. And then you define those into a result. Remember, a result is any accomplishment that can be measured and has a positive impact on profit and loss. You define it into a result by asking the question, why do you do that activity? And a salesperson will always come down basically to two results. One is to increase sales and the other is to reduce costs. And once you define that for an individual, their whole behavior changes. I can recall we had many times where salesmen were held accountable to make calls, to fill out reports and so on, activity results, and they're never getting the sales. But as soon as you change that to hold them accountable for the results, they change. You used to say you need to make 8 calls a day. Well, how do you know 8 calls a day is right? Maybe the guy needs to make 1 call for a month and he sells $30 million. The key is you have to let them focus on what they need to do to accomplish the result. Any other questions? Okay, please.
What other books would you suggest reading?
Well, if you had the bias that I had, remember I mentioned earlier The Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard? I read that many years ago. There's a lot around, but if you'll go on online, you can find a lot of Ed Schley's material on how he manages people and how results management is implemented, and that's useful. But I think one of the best publications that I read the Wall Street Journal for years while I was in business, but I now read virtually every day Investor's Business Daily. That's more of an investment tool than it is a business school, but it's got a tremendous amount of business value to it too. And I read that every day from cover to cover, even today. Yes.
Repeat my question. In today's market, how important do you see a master's degree in business or in leadership? How important is that in business?
I think it's vitally important. I really do. You know, I had another professor at the University of Utah. When I got my graduate degree, I came back and he said to me, if I were you now, I'd take that degree and I'd put it in a drawer and cover it up with your clothes and don't think about it again. The point being that having the degree opens the doors. It doesn't ensure that you're going to. It shows to whoever's interested in you that you have had the discipline to get yourself through a program and come out the other end, and that you've learned something along the way. But what really makes for success in business, it gets you in the door, but what makes for success in business are the results that you achieve. The results are vitally important. If I hadn't had the results that I had, I wouldn't have been considered for the positions that came along naturally in the process of being on the corporate track. Yes?
I noticed that when you explain all of your career path, that many of the opportunities that come to you because of the recommendation of other people.
Right.
How do you build those relationships? Were they based on friendship or in results?
Yeah, the question is how the opportunities that opened up for me came because other people came to me. And his question is, how does that happen? Well, let's take Bob Phillips, for example, the fellow I mentioned at General Foods who went to Cheeseboro Ponds and asked me to come over there. It was because I had built, one, a relationship with Bob. He liked me, and I liked him. We had a lot in common. And two, when he saw what I was doing as a member of Gray Advertising's management for his business, he was impressed. And so when a time that he needed people there, he said, you know, that Dan Howells at Gray Advertising, I'd like to have him here. And that's how it came about. With the Marriotts, Dick Marriott and I I bought one of his parks in Chicago from him, and when I was with Six Flags. But it was a mutual friend, who was the personal attorney to the Marriott family, who introduced me to him. That's the value of the corporate path that I'm talking about. There's just a lot of opportunities that seem to open up when you're on that corporate path. If you're an entrepreneur, you got to make it on your own, but on the corporate path. And I didn't have the sophistication at the time I made the decision to know that I was even making that decision, but that's the way it was. Any other questions? Yes?
How have you continued to further your education throughout your life, especially after you graduated?
Well, that's a good question, and you just got to have a thirst for knowledge. I'm retired at this point in time. Since I retired, I've become very heavily invested in investing in the stock market. I made my money during my career, and now I'm trying to manage it and grow it. So in order to do that, I mentioned Investors Business Daily, which has been a tremendously powerful asset for me in understanding the stock market. I invested all through my career, but not without any understanding of it. Now I have an understanding of it. It's the same way. I spent many, many hours in market research. I talked to people. I watched plans. I did a lot of things like that enabled me to understand. As I said, I started out with an interest in why do people do what they do. What motivates a woman to buy a paper towel? What motivates a person to come to a Six Flags theme park? I spent a lot of time understanding that, and that was an education in and of itself. And once you get the knack for that, you can then go from one business to another and understand what motivates people to do what they do. We out of time?
Well, as a token of our appreciation, we've got a UVU Woodbury School of Business pen.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.